My stepson stood up in front of 40 guests, raised his glass to a man who abandoned him at 3 years old, and told the room that real fathers don't disappear. He was looking straight at me when he said it. I had just paid off his last law school loan 4 months earlier. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to. My name is Frank Doyle. I'm 66 years old. I built a structural engineering firm from a card table in my garage into a company with its name on a building downtown. And I spent 30 years believing that if you show up for someone every single day, without fail, that counts for something. That it has to count for something. I was wrong about how long it would take for that belief to get tested. I was wrong about who would be the one testing it. And before this story is over, I'm going to tell you about one moment, quiet, calm, no shouting at all, that I will remember for the rest of my life. But let me back up, because you need to understand exactly what I built before I can tell you how close I came to losing it. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a stone and cedar house up on Town Mountain Road that I designed myself in 1994, back when I was young enough to still believe I could out-argue a mountain grade with a good foundation plan. I started Doyle Structural Group in 1988 out of a rented office on Charlotte Street with one drafting table and a used blueprint machine I bought off a retiring engineer in Hendersonville for $1,100. By the time I'm telling you this, the firm occupies the third floor of a building I own outright on Marymount Avenue. We've got 14 employees, and we've stamped drawings on half the mid-rise construction that's gone up in this county in the last 2 decades. I say all that not to brag. I say it because you need to understand the size of what was actually on the table before this story really gets going. My first wife, Eleanor, died of ovarian cancer in the spring of 1997. We had one daughter together, Sophie, who was 5 years old when her mother passed. I raised her alone for 4 years, and I am not going to pretend those years were easy, because they weren't. I burned a lot of frozen lasagna and missed a lot of piano recitals I felt sick about missing. In 2001, I met a woman named Carol Whitfield at a Rotary Club fundraiser at the Grove Park Inn. Carol was warm and funny, and she had a 7-year-old son named Derek whose father, a man named Gary Whitfield, had walked out on both of them when Derek was 3. Gary didn't just leave quietly. He left behind unpaid child support, a repossessed truck, and a boy who used to ask his mother every single Father's Day for years whether his dad was ever coming back for the school breakfast. I married Carol in June of 2002. And here's the part one need you to really understand, because it matters for everything that comes after. I did not treat Derek like a stepson. I treated him like my son. I was at every single one of his Little League games at Weaver Park. I was the one who taught him to drive stick shift in the church parking lot on Marymount on Sunday afternoons. When he got into Christ School in Arden for high school, I paid the tuition without blinking, because that's what you do for your kid. I never once said the word step in front of him. Not once in 22 years. When Derek got into Wake Forest University for his undergraduate degree in 2013, I sat down with Carol at our kitchen table and wrote out what tuition, room, board, and books were going to cost us over 4 years. It came to just over $160,000. I didn't flinch. Then he decided he wanted law school, Wake Forest University School of Law, 3 more years, another $240,000 between tuition and living expenses in Winston-Salem. 10 years, total, of checks with my name on them. Somewhere around $410,000, if you add it all up, though I never once kept a running total, because I wasn't doing it for a receipt. I was doing it because he was my son. I want to be clear about something, because people ask me this all the time now. I never once threw that money in his face. Never once said, after everything I've done for you. That's not who I am. I paid for it the same way I'd have paid for it if he'd come out of my own body. No strings, no ledger. I only bring up the number now because you're going to need it later, when you hear what he said to me in front of 40 people at the Foothills Country Club, and what his own attorney's fiance's mother said to Carol not 2 weeks after that, thinking nobody who mattered was listening. Derek passed the North Carolina bar exam in August of 2022, landed a job at a mid-sized firm downtown called Preston Ashwood, and by early last year, he was up for a partnership track review. And that's about the time his biological father, Gary Whitfield, walked back into all of our lives after 21 years of silence. I didn't know it yet, but the day Gary showed back up on Carol's phone was the day the countdown started on everything I'd spent 2 decades building. Gary Whitfield had apparently spent those 21 years doing reasonably well for himself. He'd moved to Charlotte, gotten into commercial real estate development, and built a company called Whitfield Development Partners that put up mixed-use retail and apartment projects around the Piedmont. From what I gathered later, and I mean much later, Gary's company had grown fast during the building boom, over-leveraged itself the way a lot of developers did, and by the time he resurfaced in Derek's life, Whitfield Development Partners was quietly, privately, drowning in debt it couldn't service. None of us knew that part yet. What we knew was that Gary sent Derek a message on LinkedIn in February of last year. Then a phone call. Then, 3 weeks later, lunch at a steakhouse in Charlotte. Just the two of them, father and son, 21 years late. Carol told me about it that same night, standing at our kitchen island, still in her work clothes from the school where she'd taught 3rd grade for 18 years. Derek had lunch with Gary today, she said, like she was mentioning the weather. I remember setting my fork down slowly, the way you do when something lands wrong in your chest before your brain has caught up with why. How'd that go? I asked her, and I want you to notice I kept my voice even, because at that point I still believed it was a good thing. A son reconnecting with his biological father. What kind of a man begrudges that? Good, Carol said. Really good, actually. Gary's done well for himself, Frank. He's got a big company down there now. She said it with a note in her voice I hadn't heard in years. The same note she used to have when she talked about her own family back in Hickory, the kind of pride reserved for blood. I told myself it was nothing. Kids reconnect with absent parents all the time. I told myself that for about 6 weeks, and then things started to shift in ways I couldn't quite name yet, but I felt every single one of them. Derek started missing our regular Sunday dinners. Not once, twice. Started making excuses. Gary wants me to see the new development site in South End. Gary's setting up a meeting with some of his investors. Thought it'd be good for my career to be in the room. Every sentence out of my son's mouth that spring started with the name Gary, like a man testing out a new set of car keys, seeing how they felt in his hand. I want to pause here and tell you something about myself, because it matters for what happens next. I am not a jealous man by nature. I never once told Derek he had to choose between us. I told him, more than once, that I thought it was good he was building a relationship with his father, that everybody deserves the chance to know where they come from. I meant every word of it. What I didn't yet understand was that Gary Whitfield wasn't rebuilding a relationship with his son out of guilt. Gary Whitfield was doing due diligence. In October of last year, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, I had chest pressure while I was walking from the parking deck on Broadway to my office on Marymount Avenue. I made it up to the 3rd floor, sat down at my desk, and told my office manager, a woman named Gwen Alcott who'd worked for me for 16 years, that I felt like there was a dog sitting on my sternum. Gwen didn't ask a second question. She had me in her car and at Mission Hospital's emergency entrance in under 9 minutes. They found a 90% blockage in my left anterior descending artery. The cardiologist, a calm man named Dr. Okafor, told me later that the nickname for that particular blockage, in his field, was the Widowmaker, and that Gwen driving me straight there instead of waiting on an ambulance probably saved my life by a margin of minutes. I had a stent placed that same afternoon. They kept me 4 days for observation, in a private room on the cardiac floor, hooked to monitors that beeped in a rhythm I can still hear if I let myself think about it too long. I was heavily sedated the first night after the procedure, in that thick, cottony state where you're not quite awake and not quite asleep, where sounds come through soft and slow, like they're traveling through water. I want to be honest with you. I wasn't unconscious. I wasn't locked away the way some men describe a coma. I was drifting, in and out, the kind of state where the people in the room forget you might still be able to hear them, because you look so far gone. That's when I heard Carol's voice, low, close to the doorway, talking to Derek. He's stable, she was saying. Dr. Okafor says he'll probably be out of commission for at least 6 weeks. Maybe longer before he's cleared to go back to full days at the office. 6 weeks, Derek said, and there was something in his voice I didn't recognize. Not worry. Calculation. That's the window, Derek, Carol said, quieter now, like she thought the monitors would drown her out. Gary needs this settled before his lender meeting in December. If we wait until Frank's fully back on his feet, he's going to fight every point of it. You know exactly how he is about that building. I lay there in that hospital bed with a tube taped to the back of my hand, and I did not move. I did not open my eyes. Something in me, some old animal instinct, told me the safest thing I could do in that moment was exactly nothing at all. He signed the medical power of attorney last month, Derek said, for the surgery paperwork. It's broader than he thinks it is, Mom. It covers financial decisions during incapacity, not just medical ones. Gary's attorney already looked at it. I felt my whole chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the stent. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it, flat on my back, wired to a heart monitor, unable to so much as clear my throat without giving myself away. My own wife and the boy I had raised as my son were standing 8 feet from my hospital bed, discussing how much time they had before I woke up enough to object to something involving my building, my company, and a man named Gary who had bought his son one steakhouse dinner after 21 years of silence. Don't react. Don't move. That thought, I promise you, did more to protect what I'd built than any lawyer I hired in the weeks that followed. They kept talking for another 2 or 3 minutes. I heard Derek say the words Whitfield Development and the Marymount parcel and 60% of appraised, but Gary says that's still generous given the market. I heard Carol say, softer than anything else that whole conversation, he built that firm from nothing, Derek. I know, but Gary needs this. And you're finally starting to have a real relationship with your father. I'm not going to let Frank's stubbornness be the reason that falls apart again. They left the room a few minutes later to get coffee. I lay in that bed and stared at the ceiling tile directly above me, a water stain shaped almost exactly like the state of Tennessee, and I made myself a promise. I was not going to say one single word about what I'd just heard until I understood the entire shape of it. They discharged me 4 days later. Carol fussed over pillows in the den. Derek came by twice that first week with takeout from a barbecue place on Tunnel Road, sat with me while I ate, told me I looked good, told me not to worry about the office, that he and Gwen were handling anything urgent. I smiled and thanked him and played the single most convincing role of my life. A grateful, groggy 66-year-old man slowly getting his strength back. I was none of those things. I had absolutely nothing but time, and for the first time in my career, I intended to use every hour of it. The first call I made, the week after I got home, was not to my longtime business attorney, a good man named Curtis Farrow who'd handled our contracts for 11 years and who I now had to assume Carol had probably had lunch with recently, given how close he and Carol's brother were. No, I needed somebody clean. I called an old client of mine, a general contractor I'd worked with for 20 years, and asked if he knew a sharp attorney who had no ties whatsoever to my family or my firm. He gave me a name, Miles Calloway, an attorney with an office on Patton Avenue who specialized in business fraud and elder financial protection, a term I did not love hearing applied to myself. But there it was. I sat across from Miles Calloway on a Thursday afternoon in late October, for weeks after my stint, and I told him everything I'd heard in that hospital room. He didn't blink. He asked 2 questions. Do you still have the original medical power of attorney document? I told him yes. It was in my desk at the office. Has anyone attempted to use it for anything financial yet, that you know of? I told him I didn't know, but I intended to find out. Then let's find out, Miles said, and that was the beginning. The second call I made was to Gwen Alcott, the same woman who had driven me to the hospital without waiting for an ambulance. Gwen had run the books in the office at Doyle Structural Group for 16 years, and if anyone besides me knew every account, every signature card, every wire authorization tied to that building on Marymount Avenue, it was her. I asked Gwen to meet me for coffee at a place on Wall Street downtown, away from the office, on a Saturday morning when nobody from the firm would be around. She showed up early, same as always, and she looked at me across that little table with an expression I'd never seen on her before, somewhere between relief and dread. I was hoping you'd call me, she said, before I'd even sat down. I flagged something in September, before your heart attack. I told Derek about it directly because I didn't want to bother you, and he told me it was just some preliminary paperwork Gary's team was drafting in case you ever wanted to explore a sale down the road. He said not to worry about it. She paused. Frank, someone's been requesting archived appraisal documents on the Marymount building from 3 years ago. And 2 weeks ago, someone logged into the County Register of Deeds portal using our firm's business credentials to pull the full legal description and lien history on the property. I felt that same cold settle into my gut that I'd felt lying in the hospital bed. Who has access to those credentials, Gwen? 3 people, she said. You, me, and Derek, because you added him as an authorized contact 2 years ago for the insurance renewal. I didn't know it yet, But that single detail, Derek's name on an insurance authorization form from 2 years earlier, was about to become the thread that unraveled everything. Gwen became, without either of us ever using the word, my inside source over the following weeks. She kept records. She was, by nature, exactly the kind of person who backs up her email and prints a hard copy of anything she doesn't fully trust, and it turned out that instinct was about to matter more than either of us could have guessed. The third call I made, at Miles Calloway's suggestion, was to a forensic accountant named Rosalind Pratt, a sharp, unhurried woman who worked out of a small office in Biltmore Village and specialized in exactly the kind of situation I was starting to suspect I was standing in the middle of. I told her about the hospital room conversation. I told her about Gary Whitfield's company. I told her about the county records request. Rosalind called me back 9 days later. "Mr. Doyle," she said, "I need you to sit down for this one." Whitfield Development Partners, it turned out, was not the thriving company Carol believed it to be. Rosalind's research showed 2 active liens from subcontractors in Mecklenburg County, a construction loan in technical default with a regional bank, and a personal guarantee Gary Whitfield had signed 2 years earlier that put his own remaining assets on the hook if the company couldn't refinance by the end of the year. Gary Whitfield was not a proud father reaching out across 21 years of silence out of love. Gary Whitfield was a man staring down financial collapse who needed collateral, and fast, in a prime commercial building on Marymount Avenue with no existing debt against it. Sitting in the hands of a 66-year-old man recovering from heart surgery was exactly the kind of collateral a desperate man goes looking for. "There's something else," Rosalind said. "I pulled the corporate filings for a limited liability company formed in September, 1 month before your surgery. It's called Ridgeline Transition Partners, LLC. The registered agent is a law firm in Charlotte, and one of the 3 managing members listed is Derek Whitfield Doyle." I stopped breathing for a second. Derek had never once used the name Whitfield. Not on his law license, not on his firm bio, not anywhere I had ever seen in 22 years. He had used my last name, Doyle, his entire adult life, because I had raised him, because he had asked me himself at 16 years old whether I would mind if he legally added it. And I had cried, actually cried, sitting in my truck in the parking lot of the DMV the day we filed the paperwork together. And now, quietly, in a filing in Mecklenburg County, he had put his biological father's name back in front of mine. I want to be honest with you. That detail hurt worse than the discovery of the LLC itself. But I didn't have the luxury of sitting with the hurt yet. I had work to do. Welcome back, if you're just joining us. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, because this story is about to take a turn you will not see coming. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, drop where you're watching from in the comments, and let's get back to it, because what I found out over the next 3 weeks made everything I've told you so far look like the easy part. Miles Calloway and I spent the better part of 2 weeks pulling apart the structure of Ridgeline Transition Partners, LLC. What we found was this. The company had been set up specifically to acquire the Marymount Avenue property and, alongside it, an exclusive first right to bid on all future Doyle Structural Group consulting contracts for any Whitfield development projects going forward for a term of 15 years. In exchange, Derek was slated to receive a 12% equity stake in the new entity, worth, on paper, somewhere around $340,000 once the transaction closed, plus a standing offer to leave Preston Ashwood and become general counsel for Whitfield Development Partners at nearly double his current salary. In other words, my son was set to make more money, helping his biological father acquire my life's work at a discount than he would ever make in a decade at his current firm. And the mechanism they intended to use to make it happen was a medical power of attorney I had signed on a hospital gurney 4 hours before a heart procedure, half out of my mind with fear, trusting the people around me to use it only the way it was written to be used. Miles pulled the actual document. He read it to me line by line, twice. "Frank," he said, "this document is narrowly written. It authorizes decisions about your medical care and, in a limited emergency clause, decisions necessary to maintain continuity of your business operations during incapacity. A reasonable read of continuity of operations does not include the outright sale of your primary business asset at 60% of appraised value to a company partly owned by your own stepson. If they attempt to close a transaction under this document, Frank, that's not just a bad faith stretch of the language. Depending on how it's structured, that could rise to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under state law, on top of a straightforward breach of fiduciary duty. I sat in his office on Patton Avenue and felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not rage. Clarity. The same kind of clarity you get standing over a set of structural drawings when you finally see exactly where the load path is failing. What do? I asked him. Nothing, yet, Miles said. We let them believe the door is still open. We document everything. And we find out exactly how far along this really is before we shut it. I didn't know it yet, but Miles's instinct to wait was about to give me a front row seat to something I never in 100 years expected to witness with my own eyes. Rosalind Pratt kept digging. What she found in the second week of November explained a great deal about the timeline everyone seemed to be racing toward. Whitfield Development Partners had a lender meeting scheduled for December 8th in Charlotte, the same December 8th Carol had mentioned in the hospital room. If Gary couldn't present the bank with either a substantial infusion of new collateral or a signed letter of intent on a major new asset acquisition by that date, the bank was prepared to call the loan in full and initiate foreclosure proceedings on two of Gary's existing properties, which would have wiped out most of what he had left. The Marymount Avenue building, appraised at $4.1 million, purchased at a family discount of 60% through Ridgeline Transition Partners, would have handed Gary exactly the collateral cushion he needed to walk into that meeting and buy himself another 18 months. I want you to understand something. I don't believe, even now, that Derek fully understood the depth of what his father was facing financially. I believe Gary Whitfield showed his son a picture of a struggling but respectable businessman trying to salvage a legacy, and I believe Derek, starved for 21 years of a father's attention, wanted so badly to believe that picture that he never once thought to ask Rosalind Pratt's kind of questions. He never once asked why the deal needed to move so fast that it had to be structured around his own stepfather's heart surgery. That doesn't excuse what he did. I want to be clear about that. But it's the difference between a man who plans a betrayal with cold intention and a man who gets pulled into one because he's finally being handed the attention he spent his whole childhood wishing for. I had to hold both of those truths at once, and some days, even now, I still do. By the last week of November, I had everything I needed. Miles had the power of attorney analysis. Rosalind had the corporate filings, the lien records, and the loan documentation. Gwen had time-stamped login records showing exactly when the county portal had been accessed using our firm's shared credentials and on which dates. There was one more piece I wanted before I moved. I called Curtis Farrow, my longtime business attorney, the one I now had reason to be cautious around, and I asked him, casually, whether he'd had any recent contact with Carol regarding the Marymount property. Curtis, to his credit, was honest with me. She called my office in October, he said, asking hypothetically what would happen to jointly titled business property if one spouse became incapacitated. I told her the Marymount building isn't jointly titled, Frank. It's solely in your name and the company's name. I don't know what she was hoping to hear, but that wasn't it. That was the confirmation I needed. Carol had known, or at minimum strongly suspected, that the plan required my incapacity and my continued ignorance in equal measure, and she had gone looking for a legal shortcut around the fact that the building was never hers to help give away in the first place. I sat with that for a long time. 22 years of marriage. A woman I had genuinely loved, who I believed had genuinely loved me, quietly exploring how to help her ex-husband and her son take apart the one thing I had spent my entire adult life building, while I lay recovering from a blocked artery in a hospital bed 12 feet away. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that too, because people expect that part of the story, and I'd be lying if I gave it to you. What I felt was closer to the sensation you get standing on a bridge deck during a load test, watching the gauges, waiting to see exactly how much weight the structure can actually bear before something gives. I already knew the answer. I just needed the documentation to prove it. There was one more thing I needed to do before I made a single move, and it had nothing to do with lawyers or lenders or corporate filings. I needed to talk to my daughter. Sophie Doyle is 34 years old. She's a licensed structural engineer. She's worked at Doyle Structural Group for 9 years, and she is, without a shadow of a doubt, the best engineer I have ever trained, including myself at her age. Sophie had flagged something odd about the Marymount Avenue project files back in September, before any of this had a name. She'd noticed an unfamiliar user pulling old appraisal documents from our shared drive and mentioned it to Derek directly, the same way Gwen had, because Sophie trusted her brother completely. He told me it was nothing, Sophie said, when I finally sat her down at my kitchen table in early December and told her everything. Her jaw tightened the way it used to when she was 9 years old, and someone took her seat at the lunch table. He told me it was nothing, Dad, and I believed him, because he's my brother. I want you to understand something about Sophie, because she matters more to this story than almost anyone else in it. Sophie never once, in 9 years at that firm, asked me for a raise she hadn't already earned twice over. She stayed late on the Beaumont Tower project in 2019 when a structural revision came back from the city with an error that wasn't even hers, and she fixed it overnight rather than let the client see the firm stumble. She drove me to every single cardiology follow-up after my stint, sat in every waiting room, asked Dr. Okafor questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. She never once mentioned money, inheritance, ownership, any of it. Not once, in 9 years, not even after I told her, sitting at that kitchen table, exactly what her brother and her stepmother had been discussing 4 feet from my hospital bed. "What do you want to do?" Sophie asked me, and there was something steady in her voice that reminded me, sharply, painfully, of her mother. "I want to finish what I started," I told her, quietly, "and then I want to make sure the people who actually built this firm with me are the ones left standing when it's over." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Then let's finish it," she said. I didn't know it yet, but that conversation at my own kitchen table was the last quiet moment I'd have before everything came to a head in front of 40 people who had no idea what they were about to witness. Derek's law firm, Preston Ashwood, held its annual holiday partnership announcement dinner on the second Saturday of December at the Foothills Country Club, out past Biltmore Forest. It's a tradition at the firm. New associates who've made partner that year are formally announced in front of the entire firm, their families, and a good number of the firm's biggest clients. Derek had made partner that October, 2 weeks before my heart attack, and the December dinner was going to be his formal introduction, his moment, the culmination of 10 years and $410,000 of tuition I had paid without a single complaint. Carol asked me, in late November, whether I felt strong enough to attend. I told her I wouldn't miss it for the world. I meant that in a way she did not understand at the time. The dinner was set for a Saturday evening, white tablecloths, a string quartet in the corner, the whole room lit warm and gold against the December dark outside the windows. I wore my good gray suit. Sophie came with me, in a deep green dress, quiet and watchful all evening in a way that told me she understood exactly what was coming. Gary Whitfield was there. I hadn't seen him in 21 years, and I'll admit, the man looked exactly like what he was. Comfortable, tanned, the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of never quite having to answer for anything. He shook my hand when we were introduced. Firm, easy, like we were old colleagues rather than 2 men who had spent 2 decades as strangers connected only by the boy standing between us. "Frank," he said, warm as anything. "Derek's told me so much about you. Really appreciate everything you did for him growing up. He said it the way you'd thank a favorite babysitter." I smiled and said it was my pleasure, and I meant that part, at least, completely. Dinner service came and went. Around 9 o'clock, the managing partner of Preston Ashwood stood up and gave a short speech introducing the year's new partners, Derek among them, and then invited each new partner to say a few words and thank whoever they wanted to thank. Derek stood up. He looked good, confident, the kind of ease in a room I remembered teaching him back when he was 9 years old and terrified to give a book report in front of his 3rd grade class. I had sat with him at our kitchen table 3 nights running back then, helping him practice. "I want to thank a few people," Derek said, raising his glass, the whole room quiet, warm candlelight on every face. "My mother, Carol, who never let me forget what hard work looks like." Applause, warm and easy. "My colleagues here at Preston Ashwood, who believed in me before I believed in myself." More applause. Then he paused. He looked directly at Gary, and something in his face shifted into something almost tender. "And I want to thank my father, Gary, who found his way back into my life this year in a way I honestly never thought would happen. It's not lost on me how rare that is. A lot of people don't get a second chance with a parent. I got one, and I'm not going to waste it." The room applauded warmly. Gary stood, briefly, and gave a small wave, visibly moved. dabbing at the corner of one eye with a napkin. It was, I'll admit, a well-performed moment. I sat there, in my good gray suit, at a table with my daughter beside me, and I did not move a single muscle. I had paid $410,000 across 10 years for the education that had gotten my son that partnership, and my name had not once appeared in his toast. I want to be honest with you. That silence, on its own, I could have carried. I have carried worse. I raised him. I know what I put into that boy. I didn't need a toast to know it was true. What happened next is the part one will remember for the rest of my life. As the applause died down, Derek's eyes moved from Gary to me, and something in his expression cooled, the way a room cools when a door opens somewhere down the hall. He must have seen something on my face, some flicker of the last 2 months I hadn't quite managed to hide, because he set his glass down slowly and said, loud enough that the whole table, and half the room around us, went quiet. I know what you're thinking, Frank. I can see it on your face. His voice was calm, even pleasant, which somehow made it worse. You want your thank you too. I get it. But I think it's about time we're honest about something, in front of everybody here, since you seem to want an audience for this. I set my own glass down and looked at him. I did not say a word. Not yet. You did a lot for me growing up, Derek said. I'm not denying that. But you also worked constantly. You missed things. You were there physically, sure, most of the time, but you were never really there, Frank. Not the way a father is supposed to be there. And the second I got a chance to actually know my real father, my actual blood, you couldn't handle it. You've been circling this family for 2 months like something's wrong, calling lawyers, having Gwen pull old records, treating my own dad like a threat, because you can't stand the idea that maybe he's the one I actually needed. He picked his glass back up and looked around the room, some of it performance now, some of it, I could tell, genuinely believed. Real dads don't disappear on their kids for 20 years and then come back and get treated like a criminal for trying. And real dads definitely don't try to make their son feel guilty for having 2 of them. 40 people at a formal partnership dinner, in complete silence, looking between a 66-year-old man recovering from a heart attack and the 30-year-old son he'd raised from the age of 7. I felt small in that room. I want to admit that to you plainly, because I think pretending otherwise would dishonor what actually happened next. For about 4 seconds, sitting in that ballroom with the string quartet gone quiet and 40 faces turned toward me, I felt exactly as small as he intended me to feel. And then I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I did not raise my voice one single time. Derek, I said, calm, even, the way I'd talk through a load calculation with a junior engineer who'd made an honest mistake. I'm not going to argue with you about whether I was a good father. I know what I did for you, and so does your sister, and so does everyone in this room who's known our family for the last 20 years. I don't need to win that argument tonight. I reached down beside my chair and picked up a leather folder Sophie had been holding for me under the table for the last 2 hours, waiting for exactly this moment or one very much like it. But I do want to correct one thing you said, because it's not accurate, and accuracy matters to me. You said real dads don't disappear. I agree with you completely. I opened the folder, which is why I want everyone at this table to understand that 4 days after my heart procedure in October, while I was sedated in a hospital bed at Mission, your mother and you stood 8 feet from me and discussed how much time you had before I woke up enough to object to selling my company's building to your father's development company, using a medical power of attorney I signed under duress for hours before surgery, for a purpose that document was never intended to serve. The room did not make a sound. Gary Whitfield's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. I'd like to introduce you to my attorney, Miles Calloway, I said, gesturing to the far end of the room, where Miles had been seated, quietly, at a table near the door, for exactly this reason. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked over. Mr. Calloway has, as of Thursday of last week, formally revoked the medical power of attorney in question, filed notice with the County Register of Deeds regarding the improper use of firm credentials to access appraisal records, and is prepared to file both a breach of fiduciary duty complaint and a report with the state's Adult Protective Services Division regarding attempted financial exploitation, should the transaction under Ridgeline Transition Partners, LLC proceed 1 inch further. Carol had gone completely white. Derek stood frozen, the confident ease gone from his face entirely, replaced by something closer to what I imagine a man looks like the moment he realizes the ground he's standing on isn't as solid as he thought. I also want to mention, I said, and here, for the first time all evening, I let my voice go just slightly quieter, that I had my forensic accountant look into Whitfield Development Partners' financial position. Gary, I know about the 2 liens in Mecklenburg County. I know about the construction loan in default. I know about the personal guarantee. I know your lender meeting is December 8th, 6 days from now, and I know exactly why this deal needed to close before I was strong enough to ask questions. I looked at him directly, the first time all evening. You didn't come back for your son, Gary. You came back for his stepfather's building, and you used 21 years of a boy's grief as the tool to get it. Gary said nothing. There was, I noticed, nothing left in that composed, tanned, confident face to say it with. I turned back to Derek. You spent 10 years of your education paid for by a man you say disappeared on you. $410,000, Derek. I never once mentioned that number to you in 22 years, and I wasn't going to mention it tonight either, until you decided the story you wanted the room to hear was that I was never really there. I let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. I was there for every single day of it. I just wasn't your blood, and I'm starting to understand, watching you tonight, that to you, that turned out to be the only part that mattered. I closed the folder. Effective this week, I've restructured my company and my estate. My daughter Sophie will be taking over as majority owner and principal of Doyle Structural Group, a transition we've actually been planning for over a year, well before any of this happened, because she has earned every inch of that seat with 9 years of work I never once had to ask her to do. I paused. Gwen Alcott, who has run that office honestly for 16 years, and who was the first person to flag the irregular activity that led me here tonight, will be receiving equity in the firm as well, effective immediately. As for the will, I said, and I looked at Carol now, not unkindly, just plainly, I've removed you as a beneficiary, Carol. My attorney will be in touch regarding the terms of our separation. And Derek, I've removed you from the will entirely. Not out of cruelty. I want you to hear that clearly, because I don't say it with any anger left in me at all. I've simply come to understand, over the last 2 months, that you already decided which father's name you wanted to carry forward. I think it's only right that you carry his legacy instead of mine. Nobody at that table moved. Somewhere behind us, a server had frozen mid-step with a tray of coffee cups, unsure whether to keep walking. I picked up my water glass, the only glass in front of me all evening that hadn't been wine, because I don't drink much anymore, not since the stint, and I raised it slightly, more habit than performance. I'm proud of the lawyer you became, Derek, I said, and I meant it, every word. I just wish I'd been proud of the man standing next to him tonight. Then I sat down, and I let the silence do whatever it needed to do. If you enjoyed this story so far, this is exactly the moment to drop a comment, telling me where you're watching from, because what happened over the following weeks is the part people always ask me to slow down and tell twice. The room did not explode into chaos, the way you might expect. It was worse than that, in a way. It was quiet. Gary Whitfield left first, alone, without a word to anyone, including his own son. I heard later, through Rosalind Pratt, who kept a professional interest in the outcome, that Whitfield Development Partners missed its December 8th lender meeting entirely, filed for reorganization under Chapter 11 the following March, and that Gary personally lost both remaining properties he'd guaranteed. I don't take pleasure in that. I want to be honest about that too. I simply recognize it as the natural conclusion of a debt he'd been running from for 21 years, one way or another. Carol moved out of the Town Mountain Road house in January, into an apartment near her sister in Hendersonville. Our divorce was finalized in June, quiet, uncontested, mostly because Miles Calloway's documentation of the hospital room conversation and the Ridgeline Transition Partners filings left very little room for her attorney to argue equitable distribution of a business she had actively conspired to help sell out from under me. She got the house on Beaver Dam Road we'd bought as a rental property years earlier, her retirement accounts, and nothing else. I think, in the end, that was fair, and I think some part of her knew it too, because she never once fought me on it. Derek did not speak to me for 4 months. The first time he called, it was late April, a Tuesday evening, and I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered anyway. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way I hadn't heard since he was 14 years old, and I'd had to tell him his childhood dog wasn't going to make it through the night. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 4 months, and I still don't have it figured out. I didn't say anything. I let him carry it, the way I'd let him carry it that night at Foothills Country Club. Gary hasn't called me once since everything fell apart with his company, Derek said. Not once, Dad. I thought, after all of it, he'd at least call to see how I was doing. He didn't. A long pause. I think I spent 21 years imagining what having a real father back would feel like, and I built the whole thing around a version of him that never actually existed. And the whole time, the actual thing I was imagining, showing up, staying, paying for things without being asked, being there for every single ordinary Tuesday, that was you. That was always you. I just couldn't see it, because I wanted so badly for it to be him instead. I want to tell you I forgave him completely, right there on the phone, in one clean, tidy moment, the way these stories sometimes get told. That's not quite honest. What I told him was that I loved him, that I always had, and that love and trust are not always the same account, and that one of them was going to take a lot longer to rebuild than the other. He's been in therapy since February, on his own, not because a judge or a document required it, but because Sophie sat him down in January and told him, in words I'm told were considerably less gentle than mine, exactly what she thought of him. He calls me now most Sundays. Not every one, but most. He's paid back, on his own, the 12% equity stake he was set to receive from Ridgeline Transition Partners. Since the deal collapsed, the equity was worthless anyway, but he insisted on writing me a check for what his legal work on the deal would have cost me in fees had it gone through, $4,200, as a kind of penance I didn't ask for and almost didn't accept. I kept it. I think he needed me to. Sophie runs Doyle Structural Group now, and I mean truly runs it. She closed a contract in August for a 6-story mixed-use development on Biltmore Avenue that's the largest project the firm has ever taken on, and she did it without asking my opinion once, because she didn't need to. I still come into the office 2, sometimes 3 days a week, mostly to review drawings I enjoy reviewing and to sit at the drafting table by the window where I've sat for 36 years. Gwen Alcott owns 8% of the firm now, on paper and in truth, and last month she told me, over coffee at that same table on Wall Street, that it was the first time in her working life anyone had ever handed her something she hadn't had to ask for twice. I think about that hospital room sometimes, still, the water stain on the ceiling shaped like Tennessee, the sound of my own wife's voice discussing my incapacity like a scheduling problem to be worked around. I think about how close I came to losing something I built with my own hands over 36 years, simply because the people closest to me assumed a sedated, recovering old man wouldn't be paying attention. Here's what I've come to understand, and it's the only piece of wisdom I feel entitled to offer anyone listening to this. Blood tells you where somebody came from. It doesn't tell you a single thing about whether they'll stay. I raised a boy for 22 years who I loved completely, who I'd have done it all over again for without a second thought. And for one terrible autumn, he let a stranger with the right last name convince him that showing up every day for 2 decades meant less than showing up once, 21 years too late, with a steakhouse dinner and an empty apology. Some evenings now, I sit out on the back porch of the house on Town Mountain Road, alone, watching the ridgeline go dark the way it has every evening of my life up here. And I think about my daughter closing that 6-story contract without needing my help, and about Gwen finally owning a piece of something she'd already been building for 16 years, and about my son, on the other end of a Sunday phone call, slowly, carefully, learning the difference between a father who disappears and a father who simply, quietly, never once stopped showing up. That difference, it turns out, was the only inheritance that ever really mattered. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. I'll see you in the next one.